It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
And welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. Welcome to our listeners on WHP 580 AM and iHeartRadio. You can call in 717-540-0580 if you have a question or comment. If you'd like to see some prior podcasts of the show or to read any of my columns on Penn Live or the Western Journal or the American Thinker, or for some great merchandise, check out the MarkScaringiShow.com website. Today we have a special guest, a friend of mine for a long time and a friend of the show, Mr. Charlie Gerow. Charlie is the CEO of Quantum Communications based in Harrisburg. He's a nationally recognized leader in strategic communications and a trusted advisor to leaders in government and business around the country. Named to the prestigious Influencers 500 list by Campaigns and Elections magazine, Charlie Gerow has also been selected as one of the 50 most influential Pennsylvania Republicans by Politics magazine and one of the top 10 political consultants in Pennsylvania. He's also been called Harrisburg's most politically well-connected conservative by Harrisburg magazine. He's a graduate of Villanova University School of Law. Charlie's been a Pennsylvania lawyer for more than 35 years, and he began his career as a campaign aide to Ronald Reagan, for whom he continued to work for more than 25 years. He's appeared on virtually every television network and has been quoted in every major newspaper in the country. He served as the political analyst and commentator for the Harrisburg CBS affiliate, CBS 21, for more than a decade, and you can see him on Sunday mornings on the television show Face the State. He writes a weekly column for the Harrisburg Patriot News Penn Live and a monthly commentary for the region's Business and Capital Watch. Wow, that's exhausting. Welcome, Charlie Gerow.
I think my mom wrote that for you. And by the way, before we get started, I never do this, Mark, but she said she was going to listen today because of you. Oh. So I want to say, hi, Mom. I love you.
Hello, Mrs. Gerow. Well, that's wonderful. And we're glad to have her listening. We're glad to have you, Charlie, in the studio. And today we're discussing the 2020 Democratic presidential campaign. We've got one of the largest field of candidates, perhaps in our country's history, from former Vice President Joe Biden to a litany of current U.S. senators, from Bernie Sanders to Elizabeth Warren and several others. Some surprising candidates, such as Mayor Pete Buttigieg, and hopefully I pronounced that correctly, and others. So we've got about 21 Democratic candidates in the field, with more than 9 months to go before the voting starts. National and key state polls consistently have placed Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders at the top, who I describe as the centrist and the socialist. And they were also two of the top three fundraisers for the first quarter. I think they're two of the oldest candidates to ever run for president at the ages of 76 and 77, respectively. Both men are targeting blue-collar swing voters in the Midwest, the industrial heartland of America, from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin and the states in between. In 2016, Donald J. Trump, then the candidate, shocked the world, but not me, when he won the Rust Belt, a typical Democratic bastion, and now Sanders and Biden are trying to win it back. A recent poll came out, Harvard Capps Harris poll yesterday. Joe Biden holds a 30-point lead over Senator Bernie Sanders. And so we'll have our expert political analyst and campaign consultant, Mr. Gerow, break down and analyze the two candidacies, Sanders and Biden, and maybe some of the others, and talk about their chances against each other and then against President Trump next fall. So, Charlie, we have Bernie Sanders versus Joe Biden, the two top runners in the Democratic 2020 presidential campaign. Can you give us kind of a 30,000 feet view to start things off on the campaign between Sanders and Biden?
Sure, and I should note that there are a whole lot more Democratic candidates than 21. There actually are more than 300
is that real?
filed with the FEC, most of whom, thank God, we'll never hear of. But the media suggests to us that there are 21 serious candidates, so they've got lumped in there that Andrew Ling or whatever his name is, the guy from New York who wants to give everybody $1,000 a week, which I know you're for, Mark.
I could use $1,000.
I could use $1,000 too. Now, how we're going to pay for that might be another question, but it's very interesting. I think you're right. It's the centrist versus, what did you say?
The centrist versus the socialist.
Socialist. But it's very interesting that you characterize Joe Biden as a centrist because for all his life, he was a pretty liberal Democrat. Nice guy, Pennsylvanian, but, left of center markedly. But Bernie Sanders, since the 2016 campaign, has taken that party so far to the left that Joe Biden and even Nancy Pelosi are now considered somewhat moderate or centrist. The Democratic Party has a real problem, though, because the energized base, the activists within that party, and the AOC faction are dragging it so far to the left that come general election time, where persuadable swing voters, the people that decide elections are up for grabs, they don't buy any of that, Mark. They just don't buy that far left stuff. So even Bernie Sanders is now trying to maybe take some of the rough edges off of himself. But here's the way I view it. You asked for a 30,000-foot view, and yes, your car is now squared away. The wonders of modern technology.
My car alarm went off for our listeners out there.
There was some guy going in through the trunk, I think.
But we figured it out. It's one of my daughters. I've got many of them. There are many daughters all over the place. But go ahead, Charlie.
But the situation with Joe Biden is this. I mean, these early polls, Mark, as you know, largely measure name identification and voter awareness rather than anything else. And I will tell you with a fair degree of confidence that somebody's going to emerge from the rest of that field as a principal challenger to those two frontrunners and may actually overtake them relatively quickly because they don't have much running room ahead of them. They've got a lot of running room behind them, but not much ahead of them. I mean, Joe Biden's campaign, bluntly, is all in the rearview mirror. I mean, he doesn't have the support of his old boss, Barack Obama.
Right, yes.
That's significant. He says, I didn't really want it. I didn't ask for it. I mean, if you're buying that, I got some swampland in Arkansas that you can have too. So I think Biden's got some structural problems and some political problems. Bernie's problem is he's Bernie. I mean, he is a tried and true socialist. He wasn't even a Democrat until very, very recently. The Democratic convention he attended in 2016 was the first one he'd ever been to. So, I mean, he doesn't have, outside of a relatively small sliver of the Democratic electorate, that much to do. But let me say this, and then I'll shut up and let you talk for a minute. With a crowded field, those chunks that they have, until they get lopped off, are going to allow them to be the two frontrunners.
Well, they're dominating the news, that's for sure. But I think it's interesting what you said about how Joe Biden's campaign is really looking backward. And I want to drill down a little bit more on that when we return from a commercial break. I want to talk about how former Vice President Joe Biden decided to launch his campaign and the issue that he decided to focus on with his launch video. And I'm referring to the Charlottesville incident from 2017. And we're talking with Charlie Gerow, the CEO of Quantum Communications. He's a political analyst, a political consultant here in Harrisburg. And he is going to give us his thoughts on the 2020 presidential Democratic nomination for president. We'll talk about the candidates and which one we think, or Charlie thinks, will win the primary. And then we'll talk about how we think they'll do vis-a-vis the President of the United States in the fall. So stay tuned. We'll be back with Charlie Gerow here on the Mark Scaringi Show. We'll be back after this brief commercial break. And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're here with Charlie Gerow of Quantum Communications. He's a political analyst and a consultant. And we're kind of picking his brain and getting his insights into the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination process, talking about the front runners. We have United States Senator Bernie Sanders and former Vice President Joe Biden. But Charlie's reminding us the field is large, and these two have probably the greatest name recognition. And Charlie's saying that's not all it's going to take. There are many other very experienced and hard-charging contenders there, and they're going to break up that block probably, and they'll start to get their own media coverage, and then we'll see this race open up a little bit. But I want to talk to you, Charlie, get your insights. And I want to take you back just a week ago. Joe Biden launched his presidential campaign with a video that focused on the confrontation that occurred in the summer of 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia. between white nationalists, neo-Nazis, KKK, and other groups, and the confrontation they had with the left-wing extremist group Antifa over the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee, Confederate general, and during the Civil War. And remember, the president gave a press conference, and he took a lot of flack. Well, he made a couple of statements, including a press conference, and took a lot of flack for his, I guess, the manner in which he characterized the groups involved in the confrontation. And Joe Biden called in his launch video what happened in Charlottesville a defining moment in America. He said the president's remarks about the event shocked the world when Trump said there were very fine people on both sides. And Biden since has declared that we are in a battle for the soul of this nation. And he accused the president of embracing racism and giving hate a safe harbor. And so we'll ask our political analyst, Charlie Gerow, do you think former Vice President Joe Biden and his campaign team made the right call by launching the Biden presidential campaign with its focus on the Charlottesville racial incident?
I gave you a very long answer to your last question, Mark, so I'll give you a very short answer to this one. No.
All right.
Now you'd like me to explain
that? Yes, please.
Now, I mean, for a variety of reasons. I thought that the video, frankly, was weak. The production values were great, but they were debating that video long into the night before it was released. I mean, they had pulled it back. They were going to release it. They were going to let the press see an advanced copy of it. They didn't. They wanted to monkey around with it. That tells you a lot. They didn't have a clear defining message for Joe Biden. His message is basically, I don't like Donald Trump. Well, that's all well and good, but we've seen how well that message has done in previous elections. When the Democrats tried that message in special election after special election after special election that they told us they were going to win, they lost all of them. It wasn't until they shifted on that message and came up with some forward-looking things that they did all right. The American people are looking for the future. They want to know how their lives are going to be made better. They want to know how their hopes and dreams and ambitions are going to be furthered. The stuff that went on last year, the year before, anything else, may have some appeal within the Democratic primary electorate base, but it doesn't extend too far beyond that.
Well, and it certainly doesn't do much to heal the racial divide in America when you have the leading Democratic presidential contender focusing on a very ugly aspect of our life here in America, something we don't want to have, highlighted and displayed. And the president, perhaps could have chosen more wisely the statement that he made, but he was in a very defensive frame of mind at that press conference on infrastructure. He had already spoken and given statements on Charlottesville, and question after question after question, and finally the president says there are good people on both sides. Now, what he means is there are good people on both sides of the debate as to whether or not we should remove the statue of Robert E. Lee, but that is completely lost on the media. And certainly used to the advantage by Democrats, and Joe Biden is doing just that.
Right, and the Democrats have been doing this ever since Donald Trump, well, even before he took office, as you know, Mark. And I don't think it's worked. I mean, it's picking the fly poop out of the pepper every day is a lot of fun inside the walls of an office building in Washington, D.C., but for most Americans, that's not where they are. If you talk to ordinary voters, regardless of their views of what happened in Charlottesville, it's not the kind of thing they're talking about when they wake up in the morning and have their breakfast coffee.
Now, I want to kind of move forward a few days in the former Vice President Joe Biden's campaign launch. He went from the launch video about Charlottesville and focusing on racial strife and racism in America, and pretty much saying the president's a racist and took the side of the racist, and this is going to be a big part of the Biden campaign. He then went to The View, and the ladies on The View were enraptured with the presentation of Joe Biden. It was a real love fest. But if you take a look at the videos, Biden pretty much stuttered and stumbled his way through his entire appearance. And it seems to me Biden is decent, just decent when he's reading a prepared script off a teleprompter, but when you get the guy to ad lib, or when you ask him a direct question that he doesn't have a prepared card to read, he was terrible. And the ladies on The View, they focused in on the issue of the inappropriate touching and the series of politicians and other women who spoke out a few weeks ago about how they felt that Joe Biden was invading their personal space in an inappropriate way. And one of the politicians he had supported was demanding an apology. And Joe Biden seemingly would not give the apology the woman was looking for. And the ladies on The View kind of prompted this issue and gave Joe Biden the opportunity and the floor to apologize to any woman he has offended by his inappropriate invasion of their personal space. But he still wouldn't do it. He would not apologize. And Joy Behar, the liberal co-host of The View, pretty much said, just apologize so we can move on. And no, he wouldn't do it. Do you think that this kind of mini scandal about the inappropriate touching, do you think that will hurt Vice President Joe Biden as he moves forward in the primary?
I really don't. I mean, this is the stuff that is Saturday Night Live material and great stuff for late night comics and talk show hosts and whatnot. The thing that I think is more troubling with Joe Biden are the other apologies he's making. I mean, the Democrats across the board are on these apology tours telling the far left of their party how sorry they are that they've been more moderate or centrist Democrats from time to time. You know, the Anita Hill hearings where he's saying, somehow that was a racist thing. Mark, you're a lawyer as am I. I'm pretty sure that Clarence Thomas is African American. I just wanted to check in on that. I lose touch with reality when I hear that kind of stuff. I really do.
Well, they were talking about that on The View as well, the Anita Hill, and I keep calling it the Anita Hill hearings. My goodness,
that's why they've twisted our minds.
Exactly. It's the media is just, they're into my brain. It's the Clarence Thomas nomination hearing at which Anita Hill was a witness and testified.
And that Justice Clarence Thomas, called a high-tech lynching.
Right, but there are many on the left who are not relenting on their criticism of Joe Biden for the manner in which he, I guess, allowed that hearing to envelop because he was the chairman. And there's an interesting excerpt of an Arlen Specter book in which Specter claims that Joe Biden told him that Joe Biden thought Anita Hill was lying. And now we have Joe Biden running across the country speaking to Democratic campaign groups saying he believed he was like the first Me Too man and believed Anita Hill, which turns out not to be the case.
Yeah, and Senator Specter wrote that a long time ago, long before long before all this stuff came out. You get the true feelings of people in real time, and I don't think Joe Biden was the only Democrat that thought Anita Hill was lying.
Do you think that Joe Biden will face, will this be a stumbling block for Joe Biden, and they're focused on Biden and they're trying to get him to do and say exactly what they want him to do? But I don't know that the average American has much of a recollection about the Clarence Thomas hearings from the 90s or is really all that interested in this really kind of internecine squabble.
No, that's precisely the point I was trying to make, not as articulately as you just did a moment ago. Ordinary voters are not focused on that type of stuff. These are the things that people sitting in war rooms in Washington, D.C., behind closed doors and inside the Beltway ruminate about. But it's not the stuff that folks wake up ready to go to work, discuss over the breakfast table.
I have to feel somewhat sorry for these women's groups that are so prominent in the Democratic Party that they're always talking about promoting women in the Democratic Party and promoting diversity in the Democratic Party. And here we have the two standard bearers, the two front runners for the Democratic presidential nomination, being two of the oldest, whitest men in the Democratic Party, and Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. So I have to feel a little
funny how that works, isn't it?
I have to feel a little sorry for all these women's groups that have been working their entire lives to promote women through the ranks. And we've got Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I mean, it really is the poverty of something that they are faced with. Now, there are a plethora of first-tier candidates for the Democrats. I believe that one or two of them are going to emerge as the principal challengers to Bernie and Biden.
Well, then in about a minute, let's talk about Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris. I think those are two probably first-tier candidates. Wouldn't you agree? And do you think one will pull away from the other?
I think one's going to go up and one's going to go down.
Who's going to go up and who's going to go down?
I think, to the great dismay of President Trump, Elizabeth Warren is going down.
Yeah, she doesn't seem to be.
He would love to have her in there, but she, that beer commercial pretty well summed her up. I mean, it was preposterous. And she's said and done so many things, despite the fact that she's got the Boston media market to propel her in New Hampshire. She's not going anywhere there. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, has California with an early primary. She is female, obviously. She's had an interesting record, Mark. She's pretty far left on many issues, but as you know, she was a very tough prosecutor.
Right, and I think, and she's also articulate.
Very articulate.
And if you saw her during the recent Bill Barr hearings, and she was tough on Bill Barr. Now, I thought it was unfair, but
I did as well, but give the devil her due. She was articulate, and she wasn't over the top.
Right, and has much more of a presence, I think, than Elizabeth Warren did. I think Elizabeth Warren has kind of sunk her ship with this kind of ridiculous quest she went on to find her Cherokee roots. It was just mind-numbing to me. And who really cares about any of this? And we'll talk more about the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination contest with political analyst and expert Charlie Gerow of Quantum Communications when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show. And welcome back to The Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. I hope you can hear me over that rock and roll music that's being played to you by a young Portia Marie Scaringi, who is the production assistant in the booth this morning. She's got a bright future ahead of her in radio broadcasting. And
or many other things.
We're here with Charlie Gerow, CEO of Quantum Communications. He's a political analyst and consultant, and he's giving us his expert opinion on the 2020 Democratic presidential nomination contest. We've talked a lot about Joe Biden, perhaps because a recent poll has him 30 points ahead of the man in second, Bernie Sanders. I want to talk a little bit more about Joe Biden. Then we'll kind of switch into Bernie Sanders, and I also want to invite our listeners to call in. I've been kind of hogging Charlie all to myself, but you're welcome to call in 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. And you can ask a question of Charlie Gerow about the 2020 presidential race, about politics in general, and I'm sure he'll give you a very astute and well-thought-out answer. So we don't think, and this is the consensus opinion of Charlie and I, we don't think that Joe Biden's his problems with the inappropriate touching, the Anita Hill issue, we don't think that will we don't think that will kind of stop him, and it won't be too much of a hurdle for him to get over. Then Joe Biden moves into Pittsburgh. And he goes to Lawrenceville, a former very tough section of the city. The old Lawrenceville steel mill is where my grandfather worked when his father and mother came off the boat from southern Italy. And as a young man, he worked in the steel mills there. Of course, they're pretty much all gone. And Lawrenceville is an up-and-coming yuppie area of Pittsburgh today. But Joe Biden wasn't there to talk to the yuppies. Joe Biden was there to talk to his people. So he claims the blue-collar workers, the manufacturers and laborers of southwestern Pennsylvania. Biden was there and endorsed by the International Association of Firefighters. He was surrounded by union leaders and rank and file. And Joe Biden declared, "I make no apologies. I am a union man." He struck an economic populist message that, in my view, is belied by his entire political career as being in bed with Wall Street and the major finance companies based in Wilmington, Delaware. I remember when Joe Biden was referred to as the senator from NBNA, the once mighty credit card company, the Visa and MasterCard credit card company that got me on the hook when I was in school. I remember my little Georgetown University MBNA credit card and getting me jacked up on that 21% interest rates.
So you could have done with a real education.
A Villanova.
A Villanova.
That's right. And our own United States Senator Bob Casey, he was on MSNBC, Casey DC, the program, and he said, "I think Joe Biden can also speak to folks who may have drifted away from us. Some of them might be termed blue-collar Democrats. We can get them back, I think, on some of these economic issues." And then Casey went on to define what he meant by economic issues as health care. And I think that's where he went off the rails. I think that the big issue is trade. And it's perhaps the most important economic issue in the Mon Valley area, trade. And Joe Biden was not with the union men and women. Biden gave the deciding vote in favor of NAFTA and establishing permanent normal trade relations with China. In my view, those trade deals have decimated the once mighty U.S. manufacturing industries and helped cause severe economic distress to Pittsburgh and southwestern Pennsylvania. United States Senator Bernie Sanders has already attacked Joe Biden for his free trade position. Sanders said, when people take a look at my record versus Vice President Biden's record, I helped lead the fight against NAFTA. He voted for NAFTA. I helped lead the fight against permanent normal trade relations with China. He, Biden, voted for it. I strongly opposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He, Biden, supported it. Now, polls in 2016 showed that Trump's trade stance was a boon to him in states such as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. In August and September of that year, 53% of adults in the Midwest said free trade deals harm their communities more than people in any other region. This is according to a survey by Politico in the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Biden was just in Iowa a day or two ago and defended his NAFTA vote during a visit to a very important ice cream shop. Now, when Biden was in Pittsburgh, he declared in Pittsburgh that if he is going to beat Donald Trump in the fall, he must win Pennsylvania. And the question to Charlie Gerow, our resident political expert, will Biden's history of supporting free trade hurt him among those blue-collar Democrats, many of whom voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential election?
I agree with Vice President Biden. The Democrats, or he, have to win Pennsylvania in order to take the presidency in 2020. It's a must-win state for the Democrats. President Trump could afford to lose it, doesn't want to, obviously, and will play very, very hard here, and I think he wins the Keystone State, but the Democrats have to win it. One thing that Senator Casey said that I think really reveals where their mindset is. He said, we got to get back these people that have drifted away from us. Frankly, Mark, they ran away from them. That's the key. I mean, these are folks that have been historic cultural Democrats. The folks like your grandparents that came over here and were part of the Democratic Party for years. But
How did you know my grandparents were part of the Democratic Party?
Were they?
They were, yes.
It's a good guess.
Until they got older and more established in
Right.
the community, and my grandfather became an entrepreneur, opened up a furniture store, and then became a Republican.
And that was the story for so many. Even if they didn't become Republicans, they started voting Republican, and they have been for quite a bit of time now. And all of southwestern Pennsylvania, in these hamlets that were traditional Democratic strongholds, Mark, they're now voting solidly Republican, and those votes were increased for Donald J. Trump last presidential election. So I think President Trump's got a very, very strong grip on working men and women in both Pennsylvania and in Michigan, a little bit further by extension into Wisconsin, but in these key battleground states across the Rust Belt, which the Democrats called the Blue Wall 3 years ago, but which became the inside straight that allowed Donald Trump to become president.
But don't you think Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders probably present the best chance in the Democratic Party of attracting those blue-collar swing voters in the Midwest who are not going to – they're not going to go to Elizabeth Warren.
Right.
They're not going to go to a Kamala Harris or any of the more liberal members of the party.
Well, Bernie certainly qualifies there,
well,
Mark. I think Joe Biden is the Democrats' best chance against Donald Trump. But to be very candid, I also
so
think
does Donald Trump.
Well, and I also think that's one of the reasons why he won't be the nominee, because they would rather have a far left ideological purity than a pragmatic candidate that could fare the best against Donald Trump. I mean, that's where that party's gotten to. They are really, really, really on the extreme, radical left side of the political agenda, and that isn't where ordinary voters are.
Well, let me show you. I mean, they flirted with Bernie in 2016, but then they wisened up and went with good old reliable Hillary. So do you think there's a chance they would do the same? They might flirt again with Bernie Sanders. They might flirt with Mayor Pete or Kamala Harris and then come home to Joe Biden?
The problem, though, might be exacerbated for them because although Joe Biden doesn't carry half the baggage that Hillary did. I mean, Hillary was maybe the worst presidential candidate in a long, long time. Not maybe, was the worst candidate in a long, long time. I was going to say maybe the worst in history, but then I thought about a few others, and I quickly changed my mind. But the problem is going to be there were a significant number of Sanders supporters in 2016 that really weren't happy with Hillary and who either sat on their hands or quietly walked a different direction. How large that block is, if Joe Biden becomes the nominee in 2020, will determine whether or not Joe Biden is even viable. I'm talking like him now. Yeah. Whether Joe Biden is even viable, much less could defeat Donald Trump.
Well, Joe Biden is certainly running as the populist, and so I think that's really going to help him. He identifies with the blue-collar voter, middle-class Joe. He calls himself Lunchbox Joe. Of course, he's now very wealthy. Has a $2.7 million beach house.
And I know where he lives in Delaware, too. There ain't anybody looking for lunch money in his neighborhood.
So, but he gives off that aura that it's almost Clinton-esque. I mean, the first Clinton, in a sense, where he does have an ability to identify and empathize with voters and voters who are going through
there's no question that Joe Biden is likable. I mean, he's got that in his DNA, and he does have blue collar roots. He grew up the old fashioned way, so he understands. Whereas Bernie Sanders, I don't know what he understands.
Well, Joe Biden, he talks a lot about being a Pennsylvania boy, a kid from Scranton, and it wasn't until I think when I was doing a little research for today's show that when I realized that Joe Biden moved out of Pennsylvania at the age of 10. So he gives the impression that he is a lifelong resident of the hard-scrabble northeast Pennsylvania, the coal region, the manufacturing area in that center, the kid from Scranton. He left at 10, but he's been singing the blues for the past 50 years.
But Joe was from Willow Grove, so he gets a pass.
It reminds me of my mother has a saying about Dolly Parton, who grew up poor for the first 8 or 9 years of her life and then sang about it getting rich for the rest of her life. And I think we have the same thing from Joe Biden. And here's a tell, and that is just on the campaign trail. Joe Biden in a kind of an ad hoc forum and in this very incoherent explanation said China is going to eat our lunch. Come on, man. China, and then he stuttered and stumbled and said China's not in competition with us. And so this is Joe. This is not Lunchbox Joe. This is not Joe defending the manufacturer from Pittsburgh.
That's crazy Joe.
That's
because
well, it's crazy Joe, but it's elite Joe. It's cosmopolitan Joe.
But even the elites don't believe that China isn't going to be in competition with us, Mark. They understand it very, very well. I mean, China is in competition with us, and they are going to be for the next 50 years, and we've got to be prepared to win that fight.
Well, maybe Joe doesn't want to be too harsh on China because his son Hunter has some beautiful investment deals going on in China and the Ukraine, and maybe we'll hear more about that as this 2020 presidential campaign heats up on the Democratic side. We're talking with Charlie Gerow of Quantum Communications about the Democratic presidential race. This is the Mark Scaringi Show. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this. And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And thank you to our co-production assistant, Portia Marie Scaringi, doing a great job back there. And we're here with Charlie Gerow of Quantum Communications, a political analyst and political consultant, an expert in the field who's giving us his advice we're doing a rundown on the 2020 Democratic presidential candidates who are queuing up and vying for the nomination. We've spent a lot of time on Joe Biden. We'll say maybe one more thing about Joe, then we'll move over to Bernie Sanders for the last segment of the show. But Charlie and I both agree that the president's moniker for Joe Biden, Sleepy Joe, is just not cutting it.
He'll come around. He'll find one that works.
And the president is not one to take criticism too well, so we'll have to kind of keep this hush-hush, Charlie, and not let this out. But we're not a fan. We think that there are much better monikers for Joe Biden, including Crazy Uncle Joe, which I like. And I think, didn't the president label Bob Casey Sleepy Bob Casey? So it's getting a little redundant.
It's a lot of somnambulism over on that side.
And so let's talk about Bernie Sanders. Now, our friendly, self-described Democratic Socialist candidate, Bernie Sanders, an independent senator from Vermont who once honeymooned in the former Soviet Union, That doesn't sound to me like the most idyllic place to honeymoon.
Tells you a lot about where his heart is.
There's a lot of romance in the air of the Kremlin. Bernie electrified the left-wing Democratic base in the 2016 presidential primaries. He drew major crowds, the size of which I think got the attention of then-candidate Donald Trump, who was a little envious of the crowd size of Bernie Sanders. But those crowds dwarf those of Hillary Clinton, who we all knew would go on to win the nomination because the superdelegates would make sure of that, and that's what happened. But Bernie Sanders certainly galvanized a big part of the electoral base in the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders talked about Medicare for all. He talked about universal college education, the national minimum wage, et cetera, and on down the line, kind of the typical kind of democratic socialist policies. This time around, Sanders was on the top of the polls until Joe Biden got in, and now he's a bit down. What do you think overall, kind of the bird's eye view of the Bernie Sanders campaign to date?
The problem for Bernie, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, Mark, because he has expanded his base since he got into the race, but there's not much more running room for him. I mean, even within the Democratic primary electorate, which tends to be much further to the left than most of the party, there's only so much appetite for out-and-out socialism. Now, what Bernie has said is true. He said the stuff I put out there in 2016 has now become mainstream. Well, it's not mainstream, but it's mainstream within the Democratic field of candidates, which is really kind of frightening. I mean, you listed a litany of things that he promoted, not one of which he talked about how he was going to pay for. And, the minimum wage thing that I find kind of interesting is just a little side note. In Scandinavian Europe, where the folks that promote, quote unquote, democratic socialism tell us to look for the model of utopia, not one of those countries has a minimum wage law.
Oh,
not one.
Right?
Not one.
Well, that's interesting. Someone should point that out to Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, you want to be pointed out a few things. But in terms of just runway space, I just don't think there's that much more for Bernie Sanders. He's got a committed group. They're focused. They're passionate. And that counts for a lot. So he will be in right up to the convention. But I don't think he can win the nomination.
Yeah, and Bernie Sanders reminds me in a way of Ron Paul in the 2012 presidential election, where there is something to say about the appearance of authenticity.
And he's very authentic. When folks asked Bernie Sanders about the NRA, he didn't run away from it as several. Gillibrand, she's like, going on this, contortionist tour trying to get rid of positions that she previously took. They asked Bernie Sanders about his support from the NRA. He said, I'm from Vermont. What the heck did he expect? I mean, it's just that is the kind of authenticity that voters do like.
Well, that's right. And I'm thinking back in the debates in 2012 and the issue of legalization of recreational marijuana. And I think maybe it was Rick Santorum who was in one of those debates talking about now, are we going to legalize heroin? And then Ron Paul gets the question and tries to honestly answer the question. Right. That's probably the direction we would head if you follow the same logic. And then you have Bernie Sanders now, just a few days ago, just to kind of bring this up a few years. He was asked a question at a televised kind of town hall sponsored by CNN, and Jake Tapper was there.
Another Pennsylvanian.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
from
Philly
southeastern
boy.
PA. Okay. Yeah. And he was asked by a college student, Sanders that is, about his stance that prisoners should retain the right to vote and whether that extended to terrorists like the Boston Marathon bombers and to rapists. And Sanders said, if someone commits a serious crime, sexual assault, murder, they're going to be punished. They may be in jail for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, their whole lives. But I think the right to vote is inherent to our democracy. I do believe that even if they are in jail, they're paying their price to society. But that should not take away their inherent American right to participate in our democracy. And I said, Jake Tapper, I meant Chris Cuomo. Chris Cuomo was the moderator of the debate. And like all CNN moderators, they give the Democrat a chance to kind of fix what
Bernie didn't fix it.
What he had just said. And Chris Cuomo gave Sanders a chance to retreat. He said, are you sure about this answer? And Sanders stood his ground, saying, I believe every single person does have the right to vote. That would include the Boston bombers. That would include white nationalists, neo-Nazis, KKK members in prison. They've all committed domestic terrorist acts. Bernie Sanders believes they have the right to vote. Some on the left and some mainstream political commentators are saying Sanders' campaign is over because of that statement. Do you agree? Is Sanders' campaign over?
I don't know that that's the death knell, but it's certainly one of less than 1,000 cuts. I mean, that's the kind of lunacy, and let me define it precisely that way, that most people will say is a deal killer, even if they had considered Bernie Sanders. But for the folks in the Democratic Party who are more rational, it absolutely is a deal killer. They're going to say, we can't have that kind of loose cannon rhetoric. And it wasn't even loose cannon. This was apparently well thought out because, as you say, when Cuomo gave him the opportunity to correct himself, he didn't avail himself. So this is his truly held belief, but it's one that 99% of the American people don't buy.
Well, this just, I think, drives home the point you made earlier where you talked about Sanders having a cap to his vote, having a cap to his support. And he has a strong base of support because he is authentic and he says what he believes, and there are a lot of Americans who are right with him on that. And that will carry him through probably to primary election day, but it's not going to get him the number of votes that he needs. And a statement like this is an example where he makes a statement that he knows is a bad political statement to make, saying that the Boston Bombers should have the right to vote. But that appeals to his base, but it's not going to get him above and beyond his base. It's like Ron Paul talking about the legalization of heroin. That's not going to expand his reach, and Bernie Sanders has got to be thinking about how he can get up above the cap that he's under.
And that's just to get the Democratic nomination, Mark. And then you've got to think about a general election campaign where that very, very small sliver, because the sides are pretty clearly divided and set at this point, but that very, very small sliver of truly undecided or persuadable voters that are going to make up the difference in 2020.
All right, we've talked a lot about Joe Biden. We've talked a lot about Bernie Sanders. So let's open it up a little bit more in the few minutes that we have left, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and talk about there are, as you say, 300 candidates, maybe 20 or so major candidates who have a viable shot at the nomination. Give us your thoughts on a couple that you think have the greatest chance beyond Bernie and Joe Biden.
Well, you have the killer bees, Bernie, Biden, Beto, and Buttigieg. I think all of those will be finalists. I think Kamala Harris is the one to keep your eye on. I really do, for a variety of reasons. I think that she's going to be able to stay with the front runners, and when the crowd begins to separate, she can move forward. There's somebody in the back of that pack, though. I don't know who it is at this point, Mark, but there's somebody back there that may be able to move up. I think some of the ones that are going to be also-rans are Gillibrand. I think Warren's going to be out early. I really do. I just don't think she has it, quote-unquote, and the staying power. Maybe Klobuchar, because she was the flavor of the week early on. Beyond that, I think there's a lot that are going to thin out very, very quickly in the back of the pack.
Well, let me ask you this. We have two kind of it candidates in the Democratic presidential primary, in Mayor Pete and in Robert O'Rourke, Beto.
Robert Francis. How do you get Beto out of that is beyond me.
Robert Francis O'Rourke. He is the most Irish Hispanic American I've ever heard of. But how do those two gentlemen, who have had some success capturing the imagination of the Democratic voter, how do they get up above that and start cashing in and getting votes and real support?
That's the $80,000 question, and that may be the question that determines the nomination, because O'Rourke and Buttigieg have to currently be very, very unhappy with the entrance of Joe Biden into the primary sweepstakes, because it's pushed them off the front page, has caused them to get a lot less earned media, as the discussion has been, much as it has been here on your show today, mostly about Bernie and Biden.
Yeah, but if Bernie and it looks like we're running. We're about to. Well, we'll see. We're about to.
Portia
wrap up
says
here.
you're done.
Portia did a pretty nice job.
She did great.
I
would be very proud of her, as I'm sure you are.
Well, that's about all the time we have this week here on the Mark Scaringi Show. And I want to thank Charlie Gerow, the CEO of Quantum Communications, political expert extraordinaire, for taking the time out of his busy weekend to give us some of his political advice and wisdom. We very much appreciate that. We'll have him back on the show next week. That's